They stopped her at the gate, a human wall of crisp uniforms and polished disdain. The sergeant's lip curled into a sneer, a subtle but practiced expression of contempt. "Someone who looks like they slept in a ditch," he drawled, his voice a blade meant to cut deep. "Can't possibly be summoned here." They snatched the worn canvas backpack from her shoulder, its faded fabric protesting with a soft rip, and began to pull out every tattered item as if they were exposing a grand and pathetic fraud. Eliza Vance stood under the harsh, sterile glare of the floodlights that guarded the entrance to Fort Holloway. The late afternoon wind, carrying the scent of diesel and damp earth, whipped through the open gate, catching in the loose strands of her dark brown hair. The hair was tangled, not with fashionable intent, but with the genuine neglect of someone for whom mirrors had long ceased to hold any importance. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under her eyes like faint bruises, the mark of countless sleepless nights. Her faded blue field jacket, its cuffs frayed and stained with something that looked like old motor oil, hung off her thin frame like a borrowed shroud. It offered little protection from the biting cold that gnawed at her knuckles. Below it, wrinkled military-issue trousers, devoid of any insignia, were tucked messily into boots, so worn the leather at the toes was splitting at the seams. In her hand, she clutched a single piece of paper, a summons so creased and soft from handling it seemed, in danger of disintegrating into dust. According to that paper, she was nothing more than a logistics volunteer. Around her, the world was one of sharp angles and polished surfaces. The recruits, barely out of their teens, were a sea of starched collars, gleaming boots, and arrogant confidence. They stared at Eliza as if she were a stray dog that had wandered into a pristine operating theater. Their whispers buzzed around her, sharp and judgmental as hornets. Their eyes, a mix of cruel amusement and outright disgust, raked over every tear in her clothes, every smudge of dirt on her cheek. To them, she was an anomaly, a glitch in the system, a nobody who had stumbled into a world where she did not belong. But Eliza didn't shrink. She didn't hunch her shoulders or avert her gaze. She simply stood, her hands loose at her sides, her posture relaxed but not weak. Her gaze was steady, fixed on a point somewhere beyond them, as if she were waiting for something they couldn't possibly see. The humiliation, the blatant scorn, it was a language she understood intimately, and like a familiar, dull ache, she had learned long ago not to let it control her. The sergeant, Decker, stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel with an authority he clearly savored. He was young, barely 25, with a buzz cut that did nothing to soften the hard lines of his jaw, and a smirk that screamed he loved the power his 3 stripes afforded him. He pointed a thick finger at her worn backpack, which now lay disgorging its meager contents onto a folding table. "Did you get lost on your way to the soup kitchen?" His voice was loud, intentionally so, meant to draw laughs from the audience of recruits. It worked. A few of them snickered, their eyes darting between Decker's smug face and Eliza's impassive one, as if watching a street performance. A female recruit, Private Jocelyn, all sharp eyeliner drawn like a weapon and a blonde ponytail pulled so tight it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples, shoved past Eliza to get to the check-in desk. She didn't even bother to excuse herself, her shoulder connecting solidly with Eliza's. "Logistics volunteers wait outside. With the trash," she snapped, her voice dripping with a disdain so thick it was almost theatrical. She wanted everyone to see her allegiance to the base's unspoken hierarchy. Eliza didn't so much as flinch at the physical contact or the verbal barb. She turned her head slightly, her calm, clear eyes meeting Jocelyn's for a brief moment. "I have a summons," she said. Her words were soft, yet they cut through the cold air with deliberate precision. It was not a plea or an argument. It was a simple statement of fact. Jocelyn froze for a split second, the certainty in her own superiority momentarily rattled by the quiet authority in Eliza's tone. Then, recovering, she rolled her eyes with exaggerated annoyance and muttered something under her breath about crazies, turning away to present her own flawless paperwork. Leaning against the check-in desk was a corporal, Riggs, a lean and twitchy man with a voice raspy from too many cigarettes. He watched Eliza with a bored expression, as if she were a puzzle he had no interest in solving. He flicked a pen between his fingers, the rhythmic click, click, click cutting through the static of the nearby radios. "Summons, huh?" Riggs said, raising his voice so the whole line of recruits could hear. "What's a girl like you doing with a summons to Fort Holloway?" He let the question hang in the air before delivering the punchline. "You look like you're here to clean the latrines, not save the world." The recruits erupted in laughter, louder this time. Some doubled over, slapping their thighs. The sound was sharp and cruel, echoing off the concrete guardhouse. It was the laughter of the pack, confident in its strength and unified against the outsider. For the first time, a flicker of tension showed in Eliza. Her fingers, which had been resting loosely at her side, tightened on the crumpled summons just for a moment, the paper crinkling audibly. Then, just as quickly, they relaxed. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto Corporal Riggs's, ignoring the cacophony around them. "Maybe," she said, her voice still quiet but now laced with a fine, sharp edge, "I'm here to do both." The laughter sputtered and died, not because her words were loud, but because they were unexpected. They were sharp, like a sliver of glass found in soft bread. Riggs's pen stopped its incessant clicking. He looked away, a flicker of discomfort on his face, and muttered something under his breath. The energy of the crowd shifted. They were still staring, but the open mockery was replaced by a wary confusion. They didn't know what to make of her anymore. But Sergeant Decker wasn't ready to let his entertainment go. The woman's composure was an insult to his authority. He strode forward and grabbed Eliza's arm. His grip wasn't brutal, but it was firm enough to be a threat, a clear message of physical dominance. "All right, let's see what you've got then," he said, his smirk widening as he pulled her toward the check-in desk. He was going to expose this liar, and he was going to enjoy it. The desk was a chaotic landscape of clipboards, scattered papers, and coffee cups that had left brown rings on the wood. Radios spat static into the cold air, a constant, nervous energy. Decker began to pat down her jacket, his hands quick and impersonal, the way one would search a shoplifter. He found nothing. No wallet, no military ID, no crisp folded orders in a neat pocket. There was only the woman, her thin frame unyielding beneath his hands, and that beaten-up backpack. The recruits watched, the spectacle now more compelling than simple mockery. They were waiting for her to break, to cry, to confess she was lost, to give them the satisfaction of seeing her composure crumble under the pressure. Eliza did not. She stood there, her shoulders square, her eyes fixed on that same distant point on the horizon, as if she could see something nobody else could, a storm gathering, perhaps, or a memory playing out on the gray canvas of the sky. A new figure emerged from the guardhouse, his boots clicking with purpose on the concrete. He was a captain, a man in his mid-40s with a jaw like a block of granite and eyes that had seen far more than the inside of a training base. He took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance. The humiliated woman, the arrogant sergeant, the watching recruits. His face was a mask of weary impatience. "What's the holdup, Sergeant?" His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that commanded immediate attention. Decker straightened up, letting go of Eliza's arm. "Sir, this individual claims to have a summons, but she has no identification. Her appearance is irregular." He chose his words carefully, wanting to sound professional while still conveying his contempt. The captain's eyes fell on Eliza. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze analytical, missing nothing. "If you were summoned," he asked, his voice even, giving her one last chance to provide a simple explanation, "then by whom?" Eliza didn't hesitate. She met his gaze directly, her own eyes clear and unwavering. She spoke a single sentence. It wasn't a name. It was a short, clipped string of words, a combination of a number, a color, and a celestial body. To the recruits, it sounded like utter nonsense, a line from a forgotten poem or a code from a children's game. But the captain's face went still. His jaw, which had been set in a line of stern authority, seemed to slacken. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty gray. The entire area fell silent. Even the radios seemed to hush their frantic chatter. The wind died down. In the sudden, profound quiet, Decker let out a short, nervous laugh, trying to break the spell. "The more elaborate the fakes, sir, the more we should search her, he said. But his voice cracked, the bravado gone, replaced by a tremor of uncertainty. He was looking at the captain, seeking reassurance. But the captain wasn't looking at him. The captain's eyes were locked on Eliza, a mixture of disbelief and something that looked terrifyingly like awe dawning in them. He knew the phrase. It was from a black-tier security protocol, one so deeply classified it was spoken of only in whispers. A protocol that had been officially decommissioned 8 years ago. The captain didn't acknowledge Decker. He simply gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to 2 armed military police officers who had been standing impassively nearby. They stepped forward, their movements economical and precise. One gestured for Eliza to follow. "Take her to interrogation room 3, the captain ordered, his voice strained. "Full search, her and the bag." As they led her through the sprawling base, the 2 MPs flanking her like grim bookends, Eliza's worn boots echoed softly on the pavement. It was a steady, unhurried rhythm against the rising chaos of whispers that followed in her wake. A group of off-duty recruits lounging near the barracks caught sight of the procession and, seeing only her tattered clothes, immediately started jeering. One of them, a tall, lanky youth with a face full of acne and a voice too big for his frame, shouted, "Hey, charity case, where'd you steal the jacket?" His buddies howled with laughter. One started mimicking her walk, exaggerating the way her old backpack swung against her hip. Eliza didn't turn her head. She didn't acknowledge their existence. She simply slowed her pace ever so slightly, allowing the MPs to close the distance, and adjusted her grip on the strap of her bag. One of the MPs, a stocky woman with her hair in a tight bun, shot the recruits a glare so venomous it shut them up instantly. But Eliza's face didn't change. It remained a placid mask. She just kept walking, her steps even and measured, as if she were carrying something far heavier than the worn-out bag on her shoulder, something no one else could see. The 2 MPs exchanged a glance over her head. Their hands tightened on their rifles, not out of fear of her, but out of a sudden, unspoken uncertainty about the entire situation. They were just following orders, but they were beginning to feel like they were escorting not a vagrant, but a ghost. A ghost who had just spoken a phrase that could freeze the blood of a battle-hardened captain, and who was now being led to a room from which few people returned unchanged. The door to the security wing loomed ahead, a dark maw ready to swallow her whole. And still, Eliza Vance walked on, her silence more powerful than any shout, a quiet storm gathering on a deceptively calm horizon. The interrogation room was a cold, sterile box, designed to make a person feel small and exposed. It was all metal chairs bolted to the floor, and buzzing fluorescent lights that cast harsh, unforgiving shadows. The air, thick with the chemical tang of bleach and the faint, stale scent of old coffee, was recycled and suffocating. The linoleum tile floor was scuffed and scarred from years of heavy boots dragging across it, a testament to the countless unwilling visitors who had preceded her. Eliza sat there, the backpack now on her lap, her fingers curled tightly around one of the frayed straps. She was a study in stillness, a rock in a churning sea of institutional hostility. She didn't look at the one-way mirror on the wall, though she knew there were eyes behind it. She didn't fidget. She simply waited, her breathing slow and even, her gaze fixed on the scuffed gray wall opposite her. The door flew open with a bang, and Sergeant Decker swaggered in, his boots loud and aggressive against the tile. He was followed by Corporal Riggs and, lingering at the doorway, Private Jocelyn and a few other curious recruits, their faces a mixture of smugness and anticipation. Decker strode across the small room and stood over her, his shadow falling across her face, a deliberate act of intimidation. "All right, show's over," he said, his voice sharp now, stripped of its earlier mocking playfulness. He was done performing for the recruits. This was about reasserting his authority. "Take off the backpack, or I'll rip it open myself." Eliza looked up at him. Her eyes, clear and steady, held his for a long moment. There was no fear in them, no anger, only a profound and unsettling stillness. "What's inside," she said, her voice as soft and unyielding as river stone, "isn't meant for you." And meant. Her response wasn't defiant, but it carried a weight that made Decker pause. For a fraction of a second, A flicker of doubt crossed his face. This wasn't the reaction of a cornered vagrant. He scoffed, a harsh sound to cover his momentary hesitation. "Let me guess, a cosplay kit for some sci-fi convention?" he sneered, reaching down and yanking the bag from her lap. She didn't fight him. She simply let it go, her hands falling to her sides as she watched him. He unzipped it with a vicious tug and began pulling out her things, tossing them one by one onto the cold metal table in the center of the room. The recruits at the door snickered as the meager contents were revealed. First came a pair of old, balled-up socks, then a pair of worn leather gloves, the fingers stiff and stained, the palms smooth by years of gripping something rough. Next, he pulled out a creased and dog-eared photograph of a woman who looked strikingly like Eliza, but older, her features softened by a gentle smile that seemed to fade at the edges of the aging paper. In the photo, she stood next to a younger Eliza, both of them in uniform. But the older woman's bore the stars of a general. The photo caught Jocelyn's eye. Pushing her way to the front, her lips pursed as if she'd just tasted something sour. She snatched the photo from the table. She held it up to the harsh light, examining it with a critical eye. "Who's this? Your mom?" she asked, her voice mockingly sweet, dripping with condescension. "Bet she's real proud of you, showing up here looking like a stray." The recruits in the doorway snickered again, one nudging another, as if it were the best joke they'd heard all day. Eliza's hand, resting on her knee, twitched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, a fleeting desire to reach for the photo, to snatch it back from those unworthy hands. But she stopped herself. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes on Jocelyn, and her expression remained unreadable. "She was," Eliza said. The words were quiet, final, like a heavy door closing softly in a distant room. The past tense hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Jocelyn's condescending smile faltered. The joke had suddenly lost its humor, replaced by a stark, unwelcome reality. Her hand lowered the photo, and she tossed it back onto the table with a flick of her wrist, as if it were now contaminated. Eliza's gaze lingered on the photograph for a moment, a flicker of an old, deep pain in their depths, before moving back to the wall. Her face was a mask once more, but her fingers pressed harder into the fabric of her trousers, the knuckles showing white. Decker, eager to regain the crowd's cruel momentum, continued his desecration of her belongings. A rusty folding knife, its blade dulled by time and use, clattered onto the metal surface. A half-empty pack of gum, a small, dog-eared notebook with a worn cover, but, as he flipped through it, not a single word written inside. The whispers from the doorway grew again, sharp and cruel. "What's in there next? A thrift store receipt?" one of them called out, a young man with a fresh crew cut and a fake tan. Decker grinned, egged on by his audience. This was more like it. This was reaffirming. This woman was nothing, a nobody with a bag full of junk. He dug deeper into the bag, his hand sweeping the bottom to make sure he hadn't missed anything. And then his hand hit something solid. His smirk faltered. He frowned, his fingers exploring the object. It was small, rectangular, and unexpectedly dense. It wasn't a book. It wasn't a piece of equipment he recognized. He pulled it out. It was a dark metal box, no bigger than a paperback novel. It was made of some kind of matte black alloy that seemed to swallow the light, leaving no reflection. There was no label, no insignia, no markings of any kind. He turned it over in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, shockingly so, as if it were made of something far denser than steel. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his confidence slipping. He tried to pry it open with his thick fingers, but there was no discernible seam or lid. It was a solid, inscrutable block. He shook it next to his ear, but it made no sound. Before Decker could decide what to do next, Corporal Riggs, ever the showman, grabbed the box from him. He held it up like a trophy for the recruits to see. "What's this? Your secret treasure?" he said, his voice high and mocking. He mimicked shaking it near his ear, listening for a bomb, and the recruits roared with laughter. "Bet it's empty," Riggs added, his grin wide. Just like her story. With a final flick of his wrist, he tossed the box back to Decker. Eliza's eyes, which had been fixed on the wall, followed the box as it sailed through the air. Her jaw tightened for a split second, a line of hard muscle appearing along her cheek before it relaxed again. She had been passive until now, enduring their scorn with a saint-like patience. But the casual, dismissive way they treated the box changed something. She stood up. Her movement wasn't fast, but it was fluid and deliberate, drawing every eye in the room. The laughter died in the recruits' throats. She held out her hand, palm up. It was a simple, undeniable command. "Give it back," she said. Her voice was still low, still steady, but it carried an authority that resonated in the very bones of the room. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a place of power they couldn't comprehend. Corporal Riggs froze, his grin slipping from his face as if it had been wiped clean. Sergeant Decker, holding the box, looked from her outstretched hand to her unblinking eyes and found his own bravado evaporating under her gaze. Without a word, without conscious thought, he placed the heavy metal box into her hand. The room felt heavier, the air pressing down on them. The last vestiges of laughter died out, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Eliza sat back down, placing the box in her lap. She looked at it for a moment, a strange, sad softness in her eyes, as if greeting an old and burdensome friend. The world outside the box, the room, the people in it, they all seemed to fade away. It was just her and the weight in her lap, a weight no one else in that room could ever understand. The room was a vacuum, all sounds sucked out except for the incessant, high-pitched buzz of the fluorescent lights above. Eliza sat with the black alloy box in her lap, a silent queen holding her scepter. The eyes of every person in the room, Decker's, Riggs's, Jocelyn's, were fixed on it, their mockery replaced by a tense, wary curiosity. They were hyenas circling a strange object they couldn't classify, their bravado held in check by a primal uncertainty. Eliza's movements were slow, deliberate, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy that had filled the room moments before. Her fingers, no longer tense, moved with a familiar grace across the surface of the box. They weren't searching for a latch or a button. They moved with purpose, pressing 3 specific points on the seamless surface in a sequence that could only be known, never guessed. The first was near a corner, the second in the exact center, the third along the opposite edge. A soft click echoed in the sterile room, a sound as sharp and final as a closing lock. The top of the box didn't spring open. It rose smoothly, silently, revealing the contents within. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like crushed black velvet, lay a single object. It was a medallion, but unlike any military award they had ever seen. It was forged from a metal that seemed to drink the light, an alloy of impossible darkness that made the black box look gray by comparison. It wasn't polished or ornate. Its beauty was in its stark, brutal simplicity. In its center was a deeply engraved symbol, a stylized shield, ancient in design, intersected by a single, unwavering sword. There were no words, no numbers, just that powerful, enigmatic crest. Decker stared, his mouth half open. The object was disappointing. After all that, it was just some kind of weird coin. The tension in his shoulders began to ease, the fear replaced by a renewed sense of indignation. "Is that it?" he scoffed, his voice still a little shaky. Some kind of fantasy league token? But his words died in his throat. A new figure now stood in the doorway, drawn by the unnatural silence. It was Colonel Donovan, the base commander. He was a tall man, with graying temples and a face carved by years of command, a face that rarely showed anything but stern control. That control was now gone. As his eyes fell upon the open box on Eliza's lap, the color drained from his face. He staggered back a step, one hand instinctively going to the doorframe for support, as if he'd been struck by a physical force. His breath hitched, and when he spoke, his voice was a strangled, disbelieving whisper that was barely audible. "It can't be." He took a stumbling step into the room, his gaze locked on the medallion, ignoring everyone else. He looked from the dark, impossible metal to Eliza's calm face, and a look of dawning horror and awe spread across his features. The cipher medallion. He breathed the words as if they were a prayer or a curse. "Aegis Command, it's not supposed to be real. It's a ghost story we tell cadets to keep them in line." The name Aegis Command hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a name spoken only in the most classified of briefings, a legendary, almost mythical Black Ops unit that officially didn't exist. They were the surgeons who operated in the dark, the invisible hand that solved problems the world never even knew it had. The recruits at the door, who had been whispering again, fell deathly silent. They didn't know the full story, but they saw the look on their commander's face. They saw a man who exuded absolute authority, now looking like he had seen a phantom from his worst nightmares. Decker and Riggs exchanged a panicked look. Their faces, which had been flushed with arrogant power moments before, were now a ghostly white. Jocelyn, standing near the table, looked as if she'd been turned to stone. Her perfectly made-up face was a mask of pure horror. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her mind replayed her own sneering words. "Bet she's real proud of you," like a funeral dirge. They hadn't been mocking a vagrant. They had been tormenting a legend. Colonel Donovan, his voice shaking, turned to a young tech sergeant who had followed him into the room. "Check it," he commanded, his voice raw. "Check the micro-serial on the rim, now." The tech, his own face pale and beaded with sweat, scrambled to a secure terminal in the corner of the room. Eliza, without a word, picked up the medallion. It seemed to weigh nothing in her hand. She held it out. The tech took it with trembling fingers, as if handling a live grenade. He placed it under a digital scanner, his hand shaking so badly he had to try twice before he could steady it. He typed furiously, entering a command sequence into the system. For a moment, the screen just showed a processing icon. Then, the entire monitor flashed a blinding, violent red. A blaring, digital alarm, a sound none of them had ever heard before, filled the room. Large block letters appeared on the screen, a warning that screamed at them from the digital abyss. Omega Level Classification. File sealed by Aegis High Council Directive 001. Access forbidden. Unauthorized attempt logged. Lethal response protocols engaged. The tech sergeant ripped his hands away from the keyboard as if it were white hot. He stared at the screen, his eyes wide with terror. He had just tried to access a file so secret that the system itself threatened to kill him for his curiosity. The room was no longer silent. It was filled with the deafening sound of their own frantic heartbeats. Decker looked at the medallion, which the tech had placed back on the table as if it were burning him. He no longer saw a trinket. He saw his own career, his ambitions, his entire life turning to ash. He looked at Eliza, and he didn't see a woman. He saw a judge, a jury, and an executioner, all wrapped in a faded blue jacket. Colonel Donovan stood frozen for another second, his mind racing, recalibrating a lifetime of understanding about the hierarchy of the world he lived in. Then, with a sudden, convulsive movement, he acted. His spine snapped ramrod straight, his shoulders squared. His heels clicked together with a sound like a rifle shot in the silent room. With a motion so sharp and precise it was a thing of violent beauty, he raised his right hand to his brow, palm flat, fingers together. He executed the most formal, most respectful salute in the military manual. He didn't salute the rank he thought she might hold. He didn't salute a fellow soldier. He saluted a power that existed outside and above his entire chain of command. He saluted a ghost who had just walked into his base, proving that the most terrifying stories were, in fact, real. And in the crushing silence, every person in that room understood. The world as they knew it had just been turned upside down by the quiet woman in the chair and the impossible object she had carried in her worn-out bag. You got it. Here is the fourth and final chapter, bringing the story to its conclusion while maintaining the established narrative style and resolving the conflicts. The colonel's salute hung in the air, a gesture so profound it seemed to physically alter the atmosphere in the room. It was a surrender, an apology, and an act of fealty all in one. For a long, stretched moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then, slowly, as if coming out of a trance, Donovan lowered his hand, though his posture remained rigid, his eyes fixed on Eliza with a mixture of terror and reverence. He turned his head, just enough to pin Sergeant Decker with a gaze as cold and unforgiving as a winter sea. His voice, when he spoke, was unnervingly quiet, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. "Sergeant," he said, the single word cutting through the silence like a shard of glass. "Your stripes, your sidearm. Place them on the table, now." Decker's face, already pale, turned a waxy, translucent white. He looked as if all the blood had been drained from his body. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. He wanted to protest, to explain, to beg, but he knew with a sickening certainty that there were no words that could save him. He had not just broken protocol, he had committed sacrilege. His hands trembled violently as he fumbled with the Velcro patches on his sleeves, the ripping sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He unholstered his sidearm and placed it, along with his stripes, on the metal table. The clatter of the plastic and metal was the sound of his future shattering. "You are dishonorably discharged from this service, effective immediately," Donovan continued, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The MPs will escort you from this base. If you are ever seen on or near a federal installation again, you will be arrested on sight. Do you understand?" Decker could only manage a weak, pathetic nod, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. He was no longer a sergeant. He was a nobody, a ghost of his own making. Donovan's gaze then swept over Corporal Riggs and Private Jocelyn. They flinched as if he had physically struck them. "You two," he bit out, his contempt palpable. "Pack your bags. Your transfer orders are being cut as we speak. Enjoy your new post at Thule Air Base. I hear the winters in Greenland are character building." It was a fate worse than discharge, a career exile to the frozen, forgotten edge of the world. Jocelyn let out a small, strangled sob, her carefully constructed mask of superiority crumbling into dust. Finally, the colonel turned back to Eliza. He took a deep, steadying breath, the first sign of his composure returning. He walked to the table and, with a deference he would not have shown the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he pushed a slim, sealed manila folder toward her. It was marked with a single, stark sigil, the same shield and sword as the medallion. "Your task force roster, ma'am," he said, his voice now a respectful murmur. We were told to expect a commander. We just didn't know," he trailed off, the inadequacy of his words hanging in the air. Eliza looked at the folder, then at the shattered remnants of the people who had scorned her. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction. There was only a quiet, profound weariness. She had seen this scene play out before, in different rooms, with different faces. The arrogance, the fall, the fear. It was a tiresome, predictable cycle. She picked up the folder, her movements as unhurried as ever. She then began to gather her meager belongings from the table, the worn gloves, the empty notebook, the rusty knife. When her hand hovered over the old photograph, Jocelyn, who was still standing frozen by the table, let out a choked sound. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry." Eliza paused. She looked at the young woman, at her tear-streaked face and quivering lip, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than impassive calm entered her eyes. It was not pity, but a distant, clinical understanding. "The woman in that photograph was General Catherine Vance," Eliza said, her voice soft but clear. "She was the first director of Aegis Command. She was my mother. And she taught me that pride is the heaviest armor and the easiest to pierce." She tucked the photo safely into an inner pocket of her jacket and placed the medallion back in its box, the lid closing with a final, definitive click. With her backpack slung over one shoulder and the folder tucked under her arm, she turned to leave. The MPs, who had been standing by the door like statues, now snapped to attention and opened it for her, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. As Eliza stepped into the corridor, a young recruit, one she vaguely remembered from the crowd at the gate, a boy with earnest eyes who had watched everything but had not joined in, the jeering stepped forward. He was trembling, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. "Ma'am," he stammered, his voice cracking, I wanted to say, I'm sorry for how they treated you. It wasn't right." Eliza stopped and turned to face him. The hallway was suddenly quiet, the drama of the interrogation room left behind. She looked at the young man, at his genuine shame and his youthful integrity. A rare, almost imperceptible softness touched the corners of her mouth. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said, and her voice was gentle. "You didn't say it. You didn't do it. Hold on to that. It matters." The recruit's eyes welled with tears of relief, and he stood up straighter, a heavy weight lifted from his shoulders. He had been a bystander, but in her eyes, his silence had been a form of dissent, and she had recognized it. Eliza nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and continued down the corridor. As she stepped out of the security wing and into the cold, crisp air of the late afternoon, a black, non-standard sedan with tinted windows pulled up to the curb, its engine a low, powerful hum. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his quiet presence commanding more authority than a full platoon of soldiers. He was Silas Vance, a man whose name was spoken with hushed respect in the highest echelons of government, and her husband. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply opened the passenger door for her, his eyes meeting hers with a look of quiet understanding that spoke volumes. He had known this would happen. He had known her arrival would be a storm. As Eliza got into the car, she paused and looked back at Fort Holloway. The recruits who had laughed at her were now standing in stunned, silent groups, their arrogance replaced by a sobering humility. From the window of the interrogation room, she could see Decker being led away, a man hollowed out by his own hubris. She didn't need their apologies. She had never sought their respect. She had simply existed, quiet and steady, and let their world break against the unassailable truth of who she was. Outside, the sky was a canvas of bruised purple and fading orange. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the cold, hard surface of the alloy box. The weight of it was familiar, a constant reminder of the years no one would ever know, the victories no one would ever celebrate, and the scars no one would ever see. But with the weight came the strength. Silas got into the driver's seat, and the car pulled away from the curb, gliding silently down the road. The bass, with its whispers and its fear and its belated apologies, faded behind her. It was just another stop on a long, lonely road. The folder on her lap contained the details of her next mission. The next crisis the world would never know was averted. She opened it, and as the car drove off into the gathering twilight, Eliza Vance began to read. She had work to do. She always did.